As I often say, hope is the first step on the road to disappointment. When you get to that final destination, you're likely to make camp in one of two places: anger and delusion. And right now, Trump supporters are dividing themselves into these two camps. Now, those who are angry because they're honest people and they're courageous enough to face reality and accept it for what it is. Those making camp in delusion are people who would rather themselves become liars than admit that they've been lied to, and people who would rather allow themselves to become bad people than admit people they thought were good were not. And they'll sit there and defend the horrible things these people are saying and planning to do because they refuse themselves to admit that they were lied to, deceived, exploited, taken advantage of. And that is where we are now that President-elect Donald Trump has announced most of the positions, the most important positions in his cabinet. He has betrayed his campaign at warp speed. Remember Operation Warp Speed, when he transferred billions and billions of dollars to the corrupt pharmaceutical corporations at the beginning of the COVID crisis. Remember that. So I wrote an article here for New Eastern Outlook, the Trump administration from no war hawks to all war hawks. And when I wrote this, it wasn't yet confirmed that the incoming Trump administration picked Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. And I hesitated submitting this article because I thought in the back of my head, there is a possibility that because of the immense backlash over just the rumor that he was even being considered, maybe at the last minute they'll change their mind to at least stretch out the illusion of hope a little bit longer. But President-elect Donald Trump, his campaign, the interests that surround him and determine his agenda, they have so little consideration for their support base, so much contempt for the intelligence and integrity of their support base, that they went ahead and picked Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. One of the largest swamp mutants you could possibly find to fill the position without resurrecting the corpse of Donald Rumsfeld or maybe Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, I'm going to read this article as I always do. I'm going to add additional information when and if necessary. Everything is citing facts and sources, and I will go to those sources and show you them. I will begin. In the weeks leading up to the 2024 U.S. presidential election, Americans and many around the world invested hope that former President, now President-elect Donald Trump, would grind America's wars abroad to a halt and instead invest in the United States itself. And this is what I would like to see. I would like to see the U.S. stop playing empire, has no right to. Nations around the world have a right to defend themselves against this. The United States should withdraw its military from around the world back to the United States where it belongs, the only place it is justified in being. And the United States should invest in itself, in its infrastructure, its industry, its education system, build itself up and begin playing a constructive role among all other nations rather than attempting to impose itself upon all other nations as it has done for decades. These hopes were based on rhetoric surrounding the Trump campaign. This was basically the Trump campaign's message. The candidate's son, Donald Trump Jr., remarked publicly, and this is a quote, "We need maximum pressure to keep all neocons and war hawks out of the Trump administration," a reflection of candidate Trump's rhetoric on the campaign trail. This is undeniable. Many people are pretending like this was never the case, so it's no big deal that it's all neocons and war hawks. This was the premise of his campaign. This is what he promised. And a lot of Trump supporters said about his previous administration and the neocons and war hawks he installed around him in his administration, claiming that was a mistake and he has learned his lesson from that. No, he hasn't. Obviously, he hasn't. He did it deliberately then, and he did it very deliberately this time. Unfortunately, just as was the case during President-elect Donald Trump's previous term in office, this was an empty promise meant to secure the support of war-weary Americans and possibly even throw nations abroad off balance before filling his cabinet with the most vocal neocons and warhawks living and breathing in Washington, D.C. today. Now let's talk about continuity of agenda. And when you actually honestly, objectively look at U.S. foreign policy throughout the 21st century, you will see that it continues uninterrupted, no matter who is in the White House and no matter who is in Congress, regardless of the rhetoric anyone is saying, it continues onward in a singular direction, the pursuit of American primacy abroad. During President-elect Trump's previous administration, he lined his cabinet with hardcore neocons and warhawks like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and Nikki Haley, who all worked ceaselessly to continue all of the wars President Trump inherited from the Obama administration and attempted to provoke additional wars U.S. special interests have long sought, including with China, Iran, and even Russia itself. And again, it was not that President Trump and his previous administration didn't want to provoke any new wars. He tried. It was because of the restraints of American adversaries that these wars did not erupt, at least not during his administration. During the first Trump administration, the U.S. initiated a trade war with China and other measures aimed at gutting China's largest and most successful businesses, including smartphone manufacturer Huawei, culminating in sales bans across the collective West, US-based Google cutting Huawei off from its Android operating system, and even the detainment of Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou while traveling in Canada. Could you imagine arresting a business person because you don't like that their company is successful? So when they travel inside a country you have influence over, you tell them to just detain them and put them in jail. During the first Trump administration, the U.S. also continued its military buildup across the Asia Pacific as a means of encircling and containing China within its own borders, another policy inherited from the Obama administration. So we have this article here, why Trump has got extra tough in monitoring China at sea. And this is all about the United States building up its military presence in the Asia-Pacific region, in South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, inside the South China Sea, all of it closer to China than to the actual United States. When people say China is being aggressive, China is reacting to the fact that the U.S. has more military forces closer to its own shores than to America's own shores. This is rational. This is reasonable. China has a right to react to the military encroachment of the United States along its own shores. The United States would do the same thing. And when I talk about the Obama administration, and the links to all of these will be in the video description below, China slams unprecedented U.S. military buildup in Asia. This is in reference to the previous Obama administration. So what did President Donald Trump do during his first term? He took every single policy, foreign policy, that the Obama administration was pursuing, and he continued them uninterrupted, maybe with a little bit of different rhetoric to present it to the public, but they were identical policies, continued policies. In the Middle East, the Trump administration continued the illegal occupation of Syria, which began under the Obama administration, continued carrying out strikes against the Syrian government and its allies, with President Trump bragging about pilfering Syrian oil. We remember this. A lot of people have defended President Trump, claiming he didn't know this was happening. He didn't want this to happen. He ordered U.S. troops out of Syria, and his cabinet, his administration didn't listen to him. The Pentagon didn't listen and just kept the occupation going. But it was Donald Trump himself who on multiple occasions bragged about U.S. troops occupying Syrian territory illegally with no UN mandate, no justification at all, and bragged about how the U.S. was taking Syria's oil.
We want to worry about our things. We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
The oil is, so valuable for many reasons. It fueled ISIS, number one. Number two, it helps the Kurds because it's basically been taken away from the Kurds. They were able to live with that oil. And number three, it can help us because we should be able to take some also. And what I intend to do, perhaps, is make a deal with an ExxonMobil or one of our great companies to go in there and do it properly. Right now, it's not big. It's big oil underground, but it's not big oil up top. Much of the machinery has been shot and dead. It's been through wars, but and spread out the wealth. But no, we're protecting the oil. We're securing the oil. Now, that doesn't mean we don't make a deal at some point. I want to bring our soldiers back home, but I do want to secure the oil.
It was also during the first Trump administration that the U.S. assassinated senior Iranian military leader, General Qasem Soleimani, while visiting Iraq on official business, an indisputable act of war against both Iran and Iraq. General Soleimani had, until then, been successfully fighting the self-proclaimed Islamic State across the region, including in Syria and Iraq. Now, I was just watching an interview with Pete Hegseth, the now announced, soon-to-be U.S. Secretary of Defense. And I heard him insinuate that Iran was behind the so-called Islamic State.
It actually affected me a lot more when the rise of ISIS happened in Iraq. When that black flag flew over Fallujah and Samarra and Tikrit and all these other towns that we'd fought so hard for. And you realize, what the hell? All those guys, all this time, all that effort, and this is what we got was worse? And then in retrospect, you're like, Saddam Hussein wasn't a good guy, but it turns out those dictators actually keep the lid on things fairly well over there. And they really don't like Islamists because they try to kill them. Maybe that would have been a better idea than overturning the whole apple cart and welcoming Iran into Iraq.
When in fact, Iran for years has been fighting against ISIS. The U.S. was using ISIS as a proxy to fight both the Syrian government and its allies, including both Russia and Iran. And while President Trump was accused of being an agent of Russian interests, in reality, his administration helped accelerate the U.S. proxy war with Russia in Ukraine by beginning to arm Ukrainian forces, almost certainly the final red line crossed, convincing Moscow to launch its special military operation in February 2022. It was also during the first Trump administration that the U.S. withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, paving the way for the subsequent Biden administration to station intermediate range missiles in Europe pointed at Russia. That Biden administration policy would not have been possible if the Trump administration before did not withdraw from the treaty. So all of these decisions are foreign policy objectives. The unelected corporate financier interests running America decide they want, and then it's implemented no matter who is in the White House. And you can see step by step by step how it allows the U.S. to achieve its foreign policy objectives, which ultimately go back to American primacy around the globe. I have repeatedly referred to this 1992 article, U.S. Strategy Plan Calls for Ensuring No Rivals Develop. They talk about convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests. They make the case for a world dominated by one superpower, the United States, whose position can be perpetuated by constructive behavior and sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. And that is what a neocon is, an American exceptionalist, a person who pursues American primacy around the globe, someone who seeks to advance this foreign policy objective, to ensure no rivals develop, no peer or near peer competitors, not allies, not adversaries. And that is what every single person appointed to Trump's cabinet is, a neocon, pro-war, American supremacist, someone pursuing American primacy around the globe. Now, I just want to show you these two White House statements. This one in 2019 during the Trump administration, President Donald J. Trump to withdraw the United States from Intermediate Range Forces INF treaty. And then this White House statement under the Biden administration, 2024 joint statement from United States and Germany on long-range fires deployment in Germany. So those are missiles that were prohibited under the treaty, but thanks to President Trump's withdrawal from the treaty, the Biden administration was able to pave the way to begin basing these missiles in Germany pointed at Russia. One single agenda, regardless of who is in power. The only thing that changes is the rhetoric used to sell all of this to the American people, convince the American people that this is some sort of adversarial process, that Trump opposed Biden, Biden opposed Trump, Trump opposed Obama, when in reality, they were all pursuing the exact same foreign policy goals to the extent that one was paving the way for the other. And it gets worse. Restocking the swamp. So President Trump famously promised to drain the swamp ahead of his first administration. And what he ended up actually doing was dredging it out to make it deeper and introduce more swamp creatures. And so this is what he's doing yet again. As the first Trump administration egregiously violated campaign promises of ending U.S. involvement abroad, many Trump supporters resorted to a number of excuses, including President Trump's inexperience, suggesting he may not have known who Pompeo, Bolton, or Haley actually were, and that during a second administration, his cabinet would act upon lessons learned. Well, while it was President Trump's first time in office in the White House, it was not his first day on planet Earth. For him not to have known who Pompeo, Bolton, or Haley were means he was never suitable for the office in the first place. And I don't believe that he did not know who these people were. I think he knew exactly who they were. I think he is a politician who tells people what they want to hear to secure their support before just doing whatever he feels like anyway. And that is exactly what he did last time. And that is exactly, openly, blatantly what he is doing this time. So fast forward to today. The incoming Trump administration had temporarily even bolstered that hope that these lessons were indeed learned by announcing Bolton, Pompeo, and Haley would play no role in the incoming administration. However, this was short-lived, as it was subsequently announced that the next national security advisor would likely be Mike Waltz. This is now confirmed. It is Mike Waltz, the ideological twin of John Bolton. Elias Stefanik was announced as U.S. ambassador to the UN, the ideological twin of Nikki Haley. If you look real quick, you might even mistaken one for the other. That is how indistinguishable they are from each other, ideologically and even physically. And both Marco Rubio and Richard Grenell are being considered as the possible incoming U.S. Secretary of State, men whose views are indistinguishable from former Trump Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, or U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken under the Biden administration, for that matter. Indistinguishable. And now it is confirmed that it is indeed Marco Rubio. Unbelievably, it is, but not unbelievably, it is Marco Rubio. All of President-elect Trump's considerations and appointments are enthusiastic neocons and war hawks who have spent their careers advocating war abroad, particularly against Russia, China, and Iran, but also Libya, Syria, Venezuela, and many, many other nations. Stefanik is listed as an expert at the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, a neocon-directed organization involved in political interference worldwide, including in Ukraine in 2014, beginning what has now evolved into Washington's failing proxy war with Russia. So Stefanik is a neocon involved in neocon institutions, directly responsible for interference abroad, regime change, and the murderous, destructive wars that subsequently result. While some may claim the incoming Trump administration's neocon and war hawk picks represent a bait and switch, with people obviously angry and disappointed, and understandably so, in reality, the Trump administration's inclusion of JD Vance as vice president pick was upfront an open declaration that war and warmongering would continue abroad just not in Ukraine. And how do we know this? Because JD Vance himself repeatedly told people this. Here's a Newsweek article. JD Vance tells Tim Dillon, U.S. needs weapons to fight China, not Russia. And so it's not that JD Vance thinks U.S. foreign policy is a mistake. He just thinks its priorities are mixed up. We should be waging war of aggression against China in the Asia-Pacific region on the other side of the planet instead of against Russia in Ukraine. And JD Vance, Donald Trump himself, and no one else now circulating his incoming cabinet, no one has actually said they want to end the war in Ukraine. They have all said very clearly they want to dump it on their European proxies. They want their European proxies to continue that war against Russia in Ukraine while the United States peels off and pursues much more dangerous wars with Iran in the Middle East and China in the Asia-Pacific region. That is what they have openly and repeatedly said. And so if you are surprised by this, it was because you were only hearing what you wanted to hear. You did not listen to what they were actually repeatedly saying. In this article, this Newsweek article, JD Vance made it clear that, and this is a quote, stability in the Indo-Pacific and supporting Taiwan should be a higher priority for the U.S. than military aid to Ukraine. Now, I'm gonna, as I always do, get into the status of Taiwan and how the United States is provoking war with China by interfering in Taiwan. I will get into that in just a moment, but let me just continue here. President-elect Trump's close association with and appointment of neocons and warhawks involved in the very policies he ran on opposing represents a repeat of the first Trump administration's seamless continuation of U.S. foreign policy, regardless of appealing rhetoric suggesting otherwise. Again, he just told you what you wanted to hear, but not really. And then he just continued everything that he inherited and more. The next section of the article is titled, Pausing Ukraine to Accelerate War Elsewhere. It may seem paradoxical then that the incoming Trump administration seems determined to end the conflict in Ukraine, right? He's trying to end the war in Ukraine. Isn't that a good thing? Rather than any sort of political transition in the US, this represents more of a transition of priorities among America's unelected special interests driving US foreign policy, regardless of who occupies the White House or controls US Congress. The US proxy war in Ukraine, a war the first Trump administration played an equal role in precipitating. Again, he began sending lethal aid to Ukraine. And this was designed solely, specifically to provoke Russia, to draw Russia into a hot proxy war, which then began under the Biden administration. And it only began under the Biden administration because Russia wasn't ready to launch it during the Trump administration. It takes time to organize a military operation on that scale. The U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, a war the first Trump administration played an equal role in precipitating, by all accounts, has run its course. The goal of extending Russia, right here is a literal U.S. government arms industry funded policy paper titled Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. One of the chapters, one of the options is providing lethal aid to Ukraine to draw Russia into a proxy war in Ukraine. And the goal was not to defeat Russia through Ukraine. The paper admitted that Ukraine will be utterly destroyed in the process. It was to degrade Russia to the fullest extent possible before Ukraine is destroyed. So the goal of extending Russia at the expense of Ukraine has been achieved to the fullest extent possible, with U.S. stockpiles exhausted and escalation requiring what is left of U.S. military power being reserved for a larger and more dangerous war with either Iran and or China. Washington's choice is to either double down on Ukraine or pivot toward Iran and or China before the windows of opportunity for success amid these two potential conflicts closes for good. The incoming Trump administration is lined with neocons and warhawks who have openly promoted the arming of the U.S.-installed separatist regime on Taiwan in a bid to eventually carve Taiwan off from China permanently. This is despite the U.S. State Department officially not supporting Taiwan independence and agreeing bilaterally with Beijing on the One China policy. America says that they adhere to their One China policy. And what is the One China policy? It notes that there is one China, Taiwan is part of China, and there is only one recognized government of China, the People's Republic of China, in Beijing. The government in Taipei, Taiwan, is not recognized by anyone anywhere as an official government. The administration in Taipei officially calls itself the Republic of China. It does not say that they are the sovereign government over the island of Taiwan. They claim to be the single sovereign government over all of China. They have a constitution. You can read it for yourself. It is online on their official website, and it talks about when they run elections, how they will manage the elections in places like Tibet and Inner Mongolia. They actually make a territorial claim for all of China that is even more aggressive than the claims the U.S. accuses China, actual China, of having. We hear about China's 9- line. The administration in Taipei has an 11- line. As part of preparing for this conflict, the U.S. has expanded its military presence in the Asia Pacific, spanning the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations, and will undoubtedly continue during the second Trump administration, made up of the most vocal proponents of this policy. Trump's pick for Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. This is via Reuters, July 2024. Rubio says Trump will continue to back Taiwan in a second term. So this egregious violation of China's territorial integrity and sovereignty recognized under international law, this will continue uninterrupted under the Trump administration. It has been taking place under the Obama administration, the previous Trump administration, in 8 years of Obama, and so on and so forth. This process also involves creating conflict between the Philippines and China. China being the Philippines' largest trade partner and, until recently, an important infrastructure partner. China was building modern, desperately needed infrastructure in the Philippines. The United States had politically captured the Philippines. The incoming client regime installed into power canceled all of these projects and committed resources to military installations, pointing missiles at China, their largest and most important trade partner. Trade, the Philippines will never find an alternative for. And this is all to serve U.S. interests at the cost of the Philippines' interests. Doesn't that sound familiar? Isn't that exactly what the U.S. has done in Ukraine? This is to create a pretext for an expanding U.S. military footprint upon the former U.S. colony and Southeast Asian nation. Yes, the Philippines were literally an official colony of the United States until after World War II. They got their official independence from the United States, but the U.S. never gave up trying to reassert control over the Philippines, and it still exerts unwarranted influence over the Philippines to this day. This allows the U.S. to further surround China and a possible conflict zone around its island province of Taiwan with nearby U.S. forces. So you just look at a map, look at where the Philippines are in relation to Taiwan, and this is why the U.S. is interested in creating conflict between the Philippines and China, expanding the U.S. military footprint across the Philippines so that U.S. forces are there for a war with China over their own island province of Taiwan. While the political right in the United States depicted the Biden administration as soft on China, you may have heard people, conservatives, Republicans, refer to Biden as Beijing Biden. It was actually under the Biden administration that an intensive reorganization, an unprecedented reorganization of U.S. military forces took place specifically to prepare for war with China. This included the reorganization of the U.S. Marine Corps into a highly mobile anti-shipping missile force and the U.S. Air Force's adoption of its agile combat employment strategy, dispersing U.S. air bases across the Asia Pacific to make it more difficult for China to retaliate against U.S. installations should war begin. We have articles like this from the BBC, and take note of the date, 2023, how U.S. Marines are being reshaped for China threat. We also have this from Defense News. U.S. Air Force eyes missile defense for dispersed bases in China fight. So all while Republicans played this game, and this game is meant solely to divide, distract, confuse the American people, all while they were calling President Biden Beijing Biden. The Biden administration oversaw preparations for war with China. Preparations that are now almost complete, just in time for a vehemently anti-China administration to take office and pivot away from their failed proxy war in Ukraine toward war with China in the Asia Pacific. I hope you can see what is going on and how elections are a means of convincing you you had a choice when in reality you had no choice. These transformed U.S. military forces will now be fully in place as an openly hostile anti-China administration takes power, just as the Trump administration helped set the stage for the U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, commencing during the subsequent Biden administration. So the Trump administration began arming Ukraine just ahead of the U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. The Biden administration prepared U.S. military forces for war with China just in time for the Trump administration to attempt to make use of those forces. What is abundantly clear is that U.S. foreign policy is not determined by U.S. elections. Elections merely determine the rhetoric used to sell what is otherwise a continuous agenda to the public. The faces presenting that rhetoric may change, and the excuses for why U.S. foreign policy continuously fails to change despite elections. Those excuses might change. For the rest of the globe, facing 4 more years of U.S. hostility worldwide, it must continue working on a multipolar international order that creates the conditions within which U.S. aggression abroad is simply impossible. This can and is being achieved by using financial, economic, diplomatic, and military means to constrain U.S. coercion, be it sanctions or military force, proxy or direct intervention, and they will do this through financial economic alternatives beyond the reach of U.S. sanctions and a powerful military deterrence. This leaves U.S. special interests with only one option: to work constructively with a world it can no longer impose itself upon. That is the only reason we see what appears to be restraint from any given U.S. administration. They're simply physically unable to wage the wars they would like to wage. They don't have the material resources to do it. They would like to continue proxy war with Russia and Ukraine, but they are simply physically out of the means to do so. The weapon systems the U.S. is using to wage proxy war against Russia and Ukraine are different than the primary weapon systems the U.S. will use in any potential war with China. So people who are saying, well, the U.S. is already exhausted in Ukraine, who cares if the Trump administration lied to everybody and now has a pro-war, anti-China administration ready to just continue everything from the Biden administration seamlessly and without interruption? Who cares? I care because, number one, I live in Asia Pacific. Other real human beings live here. Hundreds of millions, billions of people live here. So I would prefer not to see this region of the world turn into a war zone. But also the U.S. has stockpiles of weapons that they have on hand to attempt to wage war against China with. They have not depleted those weapons that they would use here in the Asia Pacific. It will be the multipolar world, ultimately, through its efforts, that ends up constraining U.S. foreign policy, because it's very clear there are no internal forces within the United States interested in change. The American people may desire it, but they don't have the means to make it happen. Voting for the Uniparty, and then on top of it all, lying to yourself about the outcome, about who Trump actually is and what he is doing, because you don't want to admit you've been tricked again, that is not going to change anything. As a matter of fact, you're lending cover for this to continue by not opposing it, by not speaking up against it. I will speak up against it. I will continue exposing it. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. I put all of my videos up on YouTube, Telegram, and Rumble. So please follow me, find and follow my work there. I'm also on X for the time being. You can find the links to all of this in the video description below. All of the links that I referenced, including the article that I read from, all of that is in the video description below, as are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.